5 pounds of flour, the man said. The buyer spat and nodded. No one else looked at the boy. The dust of the depot yard settled on everything with a fine ochre film, clinging to the sweat on Tomlin Sharp's neck, dulling the deep brown of the horse tethered to the rail beside him. It was a dust born of 1,000 hooves and wagon wheels, of cracked earth that hadn't seen a proper rain since the last thaw. It tasted of grit and distance. Tomlin had learned the taste of different kinds of dust in his 34 years. There was the black soil dust of the lower valleys that smelled of life even in its dryness, and the pale alkali dust of the salt flats that was the taste of surrender. This dust, here at the furthest edge of settlement, tasted only of transaction. The man selling the boy was gaunt, his face a mask of sun-cracked leather and desperation, the hollows of his cheeks shadowed with dirt. He held the sack of flour as if it were a holy relic, his knuckles white. The boy stood beside him, a small, still thing no older than 8 or 9. He was made of the same dust as the yard, his hair a pale, matted brown, his clothes the color of the ground he stood on. He did not cry or plead. He stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed on a loose board in the depot platform, as if committing its every splinter and nailhead to memory. It was a posture of waiting for a blow that had not yet landed but was certain to come. Tomlin watched. He had come for salt and blasting powder, the necessary components for clearing the stubborn, rock-strewn back 40 of his claim. His work was his life, the rhythm of it, the only thing that quieted the low hum of memory that was his constant companion. The memory had a name, Kalen. It had the weight of a brother's body, the sharp, metallic smell of blood on dry grass. The buyer, a thick-necked man named Silas Corgan, who ran mule trains to the mining camps, took a step toward the boy. He reached out a hand, not to the boy's shoulder in any gesture of guidance, but to the back of his neck, his thumb and forefinger pinching the skin there as a man might test the health of a calf. And the boy flinched. It was not a large movement, a tremor, a tightening of the small muscles in his back, a slight dip of his head. But in the frozen tableau of the dusty yard, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the flinch of a creature that had learned stillness as a shield that had just been proven useless. Something in Tomlin's chest shifted, a lock of rust and grief giving way. He saw not the depot yard, but a patch of contested grazing land 5 years gone. He saw his brother, Kalen, younger and brasher, standing his ground against a man with that same hollow-cheeked desperation. A fence post, a shouted word, a pistol drawn not in malice, but in panicked pride. Kalen had flinched, too, just before the sound, a convulsive jerk of his shoulders as if to shrug off the inevitable. Tomlin's hand, resting on the warm leather of his saddlebag, tightened. The salt and powder felt pointless. The back 40, his entire claim, a swathe of rolling hills and a creek that ran full 3 seasons of the year, land he had bled for, suddenly felt like a monument to nothing. It was just dirt, just a place where one brother was buried and the other was slowly turning to stone. He pushed himself off the rail. The movement was slow, deliberate, the movement of a man who had not made an impulsive decision in a very long time. The dust swirled around his worn boots as he crossed the 10 feet of space that separated him from the transaction. Silas Corgan turned, his hand still on the boy's neck. His eyes, small and buried in fleshy sockets, narrowed. "Sharp," he grunted, a recognition, not a greeting. The boy's father, Jedediah Kane, clutched his bag of flour tighter, his gaze darting from Tomlin to Corgan, smelling the disruption of a fragile, ugly piece. Tomlin didn't look at the men. His eyes were on the boy. He could see the pulse beating in the child's dusty temple, a frantic, trapped thing. "What's his name?" Tomlin's voice was rough, unused to anything but clipped commands to his horse and curses muttered at stubborn rocks. Jedediah Kane blinked. "He's called Elias." The name was a dry whisper. Tomlin nodded, a slow single dip of his chin. He looked at Corgan. "I'll take him." Corgan let out a short, sharp laugh. "He's bought. 5 pounds of flour." He gestured with his chin at the sack in Kane's arms. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, and complete. "I'll give you 10 pounds, Tomlin said, his gaze unwavering. Corgan's amusement soured. "I don't need flour, Sharp. I need a mule boy. One who can carry water and doesn't complain. This one's got the look of a good listener." His grip on Elias's neck tightened, a gesture of ownership. The boy didn't move. Only his eyes shifted, lifting for a fraction of a second to meet Tomlin's before dropping back to the warped plank. In that flicker, Tomlin saw not fear, but a profound and ancient weariness, the look of a soul that had already seen the end of all things. "He's not a mule," Tomlin said, the words low and flat. "He is what I buy him as," Corgan retorted, his face darkening. "This ain't your business." Tomlin knew it wasn't. He knew this was the act of a fool, an unraveling. The town already thought him half-ghost, a man who spoke only to the earth and the dead. This would confirm it. He felt the weight of their judgment before it even fell, and found it was lighter than the memory of his brother's flinch. He turned his back on Corgan and Kane, on the boy, and walked toward the land registry office at the end of the platform. It was a small clapboard building with a single window, presided over by a man named Abernathy, a clerk whose entire existence was contained in ledgers and deeds. The bell above the door chimed a tinny, cheerful sound that was obscene in the face of Tomlin's purpose. Abernathy looked up from his paperwork, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Mr. Sharp, come for more survey maps?" "I'm here about my claim," Tomlin said. He could feel Corgan and Kane watching him from the yard. He could feel the boy's stillness. Abernathy pushed his glasses up. "An issue? The boundary markers are all settled since the trouble." He trailed off, the unspoken name of Kalen hanging in the air between them. "No issue," Tomlin said. He laid his hands flat on the polished wood of the counter. The wood was cool and smooth, a surface of official certainty. "I'm signing it over." Abernathy's pen froze halfway to the inkwell. "Signing it over? To whom? Are you selling? I hadn't heard." "To Silas Corgan," Tomlin said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Abernathy's jaw went slack. "Corgan? But he has no stake in that valley. His interests are all in the mountains. And your claim? Tomlin, that's the best parcel this side of the ridge, the creek alone." "Get the deed," Tomlin said. His voice was quiet, but it held a core of unyielding granite. It was the voice he used when he had decided a boulder must be moved, a stump must be burned, a season of drought must be endured. Shaking his head, a frown of deep confusion on his face, Abernathy pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf and opened it. He riffled through the thick, stiff pages, the paper whispering of purchases and sales, of hopes staked and dreams lost. He found the page, ran his finger down the column. "Claim 74. Thomas Sharp. Attested by—" He stopped again. "By your brother, Kalen Sharp. Tomlin, what is this?" "It's a trade," Tomlin said. He looked out the window. Corgan had walked over to the doorway, his bulk filling the frame. Behind him, Jedediah Kane watched, his face a mess of confusion and a terrible, dawning hope. "For what?" Abernathy demanded, his voice rising. "What could Corgan possibly have that is worth that land?" Tomlin's gaze went past Corgan to the small, dusty figure still standing motionless by the tethering rail. "The boy," Tomlin said. Abernathy stared at him. He took off his spectacles and wiped them with a cloth, as if cleaning them might clear his understanding. He put them back on. Tomlin's expression hadn't changed. It was calm, settled, resolute. The Kane boy?" Abernathy whispered, leaning forward. "You're trading your entire claim, your brother's legacy, for that half-starved child being sold for a bag of flour?" "That's the trade," Tomlin confirmed. It's madness, Abernathy breathed. It's suicide. The land is all a man has. Then maybe a man needs something else, Tomlin said softly. Abernathy slumped, defeated by a logic he could not penetrate. He laid out a fresh transfer deed, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and began to write, his scratching nib the only sound in the room. He filled in the names, the parcel number, the legal description of the land, a litany of creeks and rock faces and stands of pine that Tomlin knew better than his own hands. Each word was a shovelful of dirt being tossed onto a coffin, the coffin of the life he had known. When it was done, he pushed the paper toward Tomlin. Your signature here. Tomlin picked up the pen. It felt heavy. He thought of Kalen, of the way his brother had signed the original claim, with a flourish, his head full of plans for a herd of cattle, for a dynasty. Tomlin's own signature was spare, functional, T-sharp. He slid the document across the counter. Corgan stepped inside, a grin of predatory disbelief spreading across his face. He signed his own name with a flourish that was a mockery of Kalen's, pressing down so hard the nib tore the paper slightly. The deal was done. The arithmetic was complete. Corgan clapped his hands together. Well, Sharp, you are a strange bird. The land is mine. The boy is yours. He turned and walked out, his laughter echoing in the small office. Tomlin followed him out into the glaring sunlight. Jedediah Kane was still standing there, clutching the flower, his eyes wide with the enormity of what had just happened. He had come to sell his son for a pittance and had instead witnessed the transfer of a kingdom. He looked at Tomlin, then at the flower, then at his son, and a tremor of something, shame, or relief, or both, ran through his emaciated frame. He gave a jerky nod, turned, and scurried away, vanishing into the dusty anonymity of the depot. He did not look back. Now it was just Tomlin and the boy, Elias, and the space between them was filled with the ghost of a 600-acre claim, a running creek, and a brother's grave. Tomlin walked over to him. He knelt down, not too close, bringing himself to the boy's level. The dust, the noise of the depot, the judgment in the eyes of the few onlookers, it all fell away. There was only the boy's face, smudged with dirt, his lips chapped. Elias, Tomlin said. The name felt foreign on his tongue. My name is Tomlin. The boy did not respond. He was still looking at the plank on the platform. There's no more reason to watch that board, Tomlin said, his voice gentle. We're leaving. He stood up and untied his horse, a big, steady gelding named Stone. He expected he would have to pull the boy, to command him. Instead, when he started to walk, he heard the soft scuff of small, worn-out boots following a few paces behind him. He didn't look back to check. He just walked, leading the horse, feeling the boy's presence behind him like a second shadow, a weight he had just willingly, inexplicably, taken upon himself. He had traded the earth for this small, silent life. He had no land, no home to go to, nothing but the salt and powder in his saddlebags and the quiet, flinching boy in his wake. And for the first time in 5 years, the hum of memory was silent, replaced by the sound of footsteps in the dust. They walked out of the depot, past the saloon where men paused their drinking to stare, past the blacksmith's forge where the hammer blows slowed, past the mercantile where Mrs. Gable stood on her porch with her arms crossed, her face a mask of stern disapproval. The whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. Madman gave it all away, for the Kane boy of all people. Tomlin heard them, but the words had no purchase. They were about a man who owned land, a man who had a place in the world. He was no longer that man. He led the horse and the boy toward the open country, away from the clutter of the settlement. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The land here was flat and unforgiving, dotted with sagebrush and skeletal-looking cholla. It was no man's land, the space between claims. After an hour of walking, the depot a mere smudge on the horizon behind them, Tomlin stopped. He slid the saddlebags off stone and from one pulled a water skin and a piece of dried venison. He handed the skin to Elias. The boy stared at it, his hands remaining at his sides. "It's water," Tomlin said. "Drink." Slowly, as if expecting the offer to be a trick, Elias reached out and took the skin. His hands were small and grimy, his nails broken. He fumbled with the wooden stopper for a moment before getting it free. He drank, his throat working convulsively. He drank for a long time, then stopped abruptly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand as he looked at Tomlin, his expression one of calculation, as if trying to judge how much he was allowed. "Drink your fill," Tomlin said. Elias drank again, more slowly this time, and then carefully put the stopper back in and handed the skin back. Tomlin took a piece of venison, tore it in two, and offered one half to the boy. This time, the hesitation was shorter. Elias took the meat and began to chew on it with a serious, focused intensity, his small jaw working hard. They ate in silence as the sky deepened to indigo. The air grew cooler. Tomlin built a small fire, not for warmth, but for company. The flames pushed back the immense, pressing darkness of the plains. Stone grazed nearby, his tearing of the dry grass a rhythmic, comforting sound. Elias sat on the other side of the fire, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes watching the flames. He had not said a word since Tomlin had learned his name. He was a vessel of silence. Tomlin didn't push him. He understood silence. It had been his own language for 5 years. He spread out his bedroll on one side of the fire and a spare blanket on the other. "That's for you," he said, nodding toward the blanket. Elias looked at the blanket, then at Tomlin, then back at the fire. For a long time he didn't move. Tomlin lay down on his bedroll, pulling his hat over his eyes. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening. Listening to the fire crackle, to the horses cropping, to the vast, empty breathing of the prairie. After what felt like an hour, he heard a soft rustling. He peered out from under the brim of his hat. Elias had crept over to the blanket and was lying on his side, curled into a tight ball, facing the fire. A coyote yipped in the distance, a lonely, jagged sound. Tomlin closed his eyes. He had no plan. He had no farm. The deed to his life was in Silas Corgan's pocket. He had traded a future for a past that was not even his own. He should have felt terror, a deep, gnawing regret. Instead, what he felt was a strange and unfamiliar quiet. The weight was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer the dead weight of a buried brother, but the living weight of the small, breathing boy on the other side of the fire. The next morning, Tomlin was awake before the sun, the habit of a farmer's life too deep to break. The fire was a bed of pale embers. Elias was still asleep, a faint, rhythmic puff of breath, the only sign of life. Tomlin rekindled the fire and put a small pot of water on to heat for coffee. As the sky lightened from black to a soft, pearly gray, the boy stirred. He sat up, his movements stiff from the cold ground, and looked around, his eyes wide with a moment of disorientation before they settled on Tomlin. The guarded, waiting expression returned to his face. Tomlin passed him a cup of water. "We'll move west," Tomlin said, more to himself than to the boy. "Away from the claims. There's land no one's bothered with up by the broken ridge. Hard land, but land all the same." He didn't know why he was saying it. There was no we, not yet. There was just him and a boy he had bought. But the words felt right. A farmer without land was a creature without purpose. He had to find dirt to put his hands in. It was the only way he knew how to think. They traveled for 3 days. The landscape grew harsher, the ground turning from soil to rock-strewn shale. They spoke little. The rhythm of their days was dictated by the sun and the terrain. Walk, rest, eat, walk again. Tomlin found himself observing the boy. Elias was preternaturally quiet, his footsteps making almost no sound. He was watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ground, the sky. He was a child who had learned to survive by being invisible. On the third afternoon, as they were watering stone at a muddy, reed-choked seep, Elias spoke. His voice was a dry rasp. "Where is he?" Tomlin looked up from tightening the horse's cinch. "Who?" "The man," Elias said, his gaze on the ground. "The one with the flower." Tomlin straightened up slowly. He chose his words with care. "He's gone his own way." "Is he my father?" Elias asked. The question was flat, without inflection, a request for a fact, not a search for comfort. Tomlin looked at the boy's bowed head, the pale hair falling over his forehead. He thought of Jedediah Cain, of his hollow eyes and the desperate clutch of his hands on that sack of flour. He thought of what it would take for a man to do that. And then he thought of the story he'd heard, the one that had followed Jedediah Cain like a foul smell ever since he'd drifted into the territory a few years back. The story of a dispute over a stray calf, a flash of temper, a good man left dead in the grass. A man named Kalen Sharp. The connection hadn't been made at the depot. In the heat of the moment, he'd only seen the flinch, heard his brother's name in the silent chambers of his heart. The name Cain had been just a name. But now, in the quiet of the wilderness, the pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard certainty of a jail door locking. The man who sold the boy for flour, Jedediah Cain, the man who shot Kalen. Tomlin felt a wave of dizziness, the landscape wavering at the edges. The sun seemed to beat down with a personal malice. He had given up his brother's legacy, the very land Kalen had died for, to save the son of his brother's killer. The irony was a physical sickness, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He wanted to rage. He wanted to grab the boy and demand to know, to shout at the heavens for their cruel, cosmic joke. He looked at Elias. The boy was still waiting for an answer, his small shoulders hunched in that familiar, protective crouch. He was just a child, a piece of flotsam cast off from a wreck Tomlin hadn't even seen. He was not his father. He was not the gun, not the argument, not the spilled blood. He was just a boy named Elias. Tomlin took a slow breath, the air burning his lungs. The rage subsided, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness, and something else, a strange, terrible clarity. The cycle of debt and payment, of blood for blood, had ended with him. It had ended in Abernathy's office, with a signature on a piece of paper. He had not bought the son of his enemy for revenge. He had not bought him for forgiveness, for he did not know how to offer it. He had bought him because the boy had flinched, and that had been enough. The rest was just a story that had already been written. Now he had to write a new one. "Yes," Tomlin said, his voice level. "He was your father." He used the past tense. It was deliberate. That man, the one with the flower, was in the past. Elias nodded once, as if confirming a fact he already knew. He said nothing more. He turned and picked up a smooth, gray stone from the mud, rubbing his thumb over its surface. The conversation was over. But the truth of it now lay between them, a new and complex landscape they would have to learn to navigate, a field of stones that would have to be cleared before anything could be planted. They reached the base of the broken ridge 2 days later. It was land no one wanted, a shallow, wind-swept valley filled with scree and stunted juniper. The soil, where it could be seen, was thin and pale. A small, seasonal creek, now just a trickle, cut through the center of it. It was a place of immense labor for little reward. It was perfect. "This is it," Tomlin said, stopping stone. Elias looked around at the bleak expanse. He had seen land like this before. It was the kind of land men gave up on. For the first week, they did nothing but clear a space. They built a lean-to against a rock outcropping, a simple shelter of juniper logs and a tarp. And then they began to clear the stones. It was brutal, back-breaking work. Every morning, Tomlin would rise and start a fire. They would eat a little jerky or cornmeal mush, and then they would walk into the field of stones. Tomlin had his shovel and a pry bar he'd kept from the farm. Elias was too small for such tools. Tomlin found a flat, sturdy piece of shale for him. The small ones first, Tomlin showed him, prying a fist-sized rock from the earth and tossing it onto a growing pile at the edge of their chosen plot. "We make a wall with them." Elias watched, then bent and began to do the same. He worked silently, methodically. He would pick up a stone, carry it to the edge of the clearing, and place it carefully on the pile, which was slowly, painstakingly, becoming a wall. He never complained. He never faltered. His small body was wiry and tough. He worked until Tomlin told him to stop, and then he would eat what was given to him and fall asleep almost instantly. Weeks turned into a month. The seasons began to turn. The air grew a sharper edge in the mornings. The stone wall grew, a long gray spine along the edge of a patch of earth that was, inch by agonizing inch, becoming a field. It was maybe a quarter of an acre, a pittance, but it was clear. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Tomlin was sharpening the edge of his shovel with a file. The rhythmic shink, shink, shink was the only sound. "Why?" Elias asked. Tomlin paused, resting the file on the metal. "Why what?" "The land," Elias said, his voice quiet. "You gave it away." Tomlin looked into the fire. He had known this question would come. He had no easy answer. "The man who owned it before me didn't need it anymore," he said. "Your brother," Elias stated. It wasn't a question. He had heard the whispers in the depot. He had pieced it together. Tomlin nodded. His name was Kalen. He said the name aloud to the boy for the first time. It felt both heavy and light, like a stone he had finally lifted. "My father," Elias started, then stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Your father was a desperate man," Tomlin said, his voice flat and devoid of judgment. "Sometimes desperate men do things that can't be undone. The land had that story on it. I got tired of reading it." "So you gave it away," Elias said, working it out. "Some things are too heavy to own," Tomlin said. He went back to filing his shovel. Shink, shink, shink. The conversation was over, but something had been planted in the space between them. A single, fragile seed of understanding. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting that melted by midday, but served as a warning. Tomlin knew they couldn't survive a winter in the lean-to. He had sold stone in the nearest mining camp, a settlement even rougher than the depot, for 2 bags of beans, a side of salt pork, and an old single-bitted axe. The sale of the horse felt like cutting off a limb, but it was a matter of survival. The arithmetic was, as always, brutal. With the axe, he began to fell the larger junipers and the few tough pines that clung to the slopes of the ridge. The work was slow. The wood was gnarled and dense. Elias helped. He couldn't swing the axe, but he could gather the smaller branches, trim the limbs once a tree was down, and help drag the logs. He worked with the same silent diligence he applied to the stones, his face set in concentration. They were building a cabin, a small one-room box, not much bigger than the lean-to, but with solid walls and a roof that might hold the weight of the snow. They chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and dry grass, their hands raw and cracked from the cold mud. They built a stone fireplace at one end, a clumsy, uneven thing, but Tomlin knew how to draw a flue. He had learned from his father long ago, in another life. As the cabin took shape, so did something else, a partnership. It wasn't spoken, it was built, log by log, stone by stone. It was in the way Tomlin would pause, holding a log, and Elias would know to slide the supporting rock underneath. It was in the way Elias would have a pile of kindling ready by the fire pit before Tomlin even had to ask. They moved around each other with a quiet, practiced economy of motion. One afternoon, a cold wind whipping down from the ridge, they were fitting the last log of the roof into place. It was heavy. Tomlin was on the makeshift roof, straining, his boots slipping on the raw timbers. Elias was on the ground, using a long pole as a lever to help push the log up. "A little more," Tomlin grunted, his muscles screaming. Elias put his entire meager weight into the pole. His face was red with effort, his breath coming in white plumes. The log shifted, settled into its notch with a solid, satisfying thud. Tomlin sat down on the roof beam, breathing heavily. He looked down at the boy. Elias was leaning on his pole, also breathing hard, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He looked up at Tomlin, and for the first time, a small, tentative smile touched the corner of his lips. It was a fleeting thing, but it was there. Tomlin felt something in his own chest unclench, a knot of iron he hadn't even known was there. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was his own version of a smile. That night, they slept in the cabin for the first time. A real fire burned in the hearth, filling the small space with warmth and a flickering golden light. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it was still. They had built this small pocket of safety in a hostile world. Lying in his bedroll, Tomlin listened to the fire and the wind and the steady breathing of the boy asleep on the other side of the hearth. He thought of the claim he had given away, of the fine two-room house Kalin had planned, the one they were supposed to build together. This rough, clumsy box was nothing like it. And yet, it felt more like a home than that unbuilt dream ever had. He had traded a legacy of land for this, for the feeling of a log settling into place, for the shared breath of effort in the cold air, for the ghost of a smile on a dusty face. It was a strange and painful arithmetic, but tonight, for the first time, the sum of it felt like something more than loss. The winter was long and lean. They lived on the beans and the salt pork, supplemented by the few rabbits Tomlin managed to snare. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the path to the creek, and the line of his snares. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who have learned the rhythms of each other's existence. Elias grew. It wasn't a dramatic change, but Tomlin noticed it in the way his trousers were now an inch too short, in the new breadth of his shoulders. The hollowness in his cheeks began to fill out. The land, even in its sparseness, was feeding him. The work was making him strong. Tomlin taught him things, not with lectures, but with actions. How to read the snow for tracks, how to bank a fire so it would last through the night, how to sharpen a knife, how to mend a tear in his own clothes with a clumsy, heavy-fingered stitch. These were the lessons of survival, the catechism of a hard-won life. One evening in the deep of winter, a blizzard raging outside, Tomlin was carving a piece of juniper wood. He was making a horse, a small, simple toy. His hands, though calloused and thick, moved with a surprising delicacy. Elias watched him, his chin resting on his knees. "Who taught you that?" Elias asked, his voice soft in the firelight. "My father," Tomlin said without looking up. "He wasn't much of a farmer, but he could make wood do what he wanted." "Was he like you?" Tomlin paused his carving. He considered the question. His father had been a dreamer, a man full of songs and stories, always looking at the horizon for something that wasn't there. He had died of a fever, his dreams turning to dust in his hands. Tomlin was his opposite, a man of the earth, his gaze fixed on the ground at his feet. And Kalin had been a mix of both, the dreamer and the worker. That's what had made him so bright and so vulnerable. "No," Tomlin said finally. "He wasn't like me." He held up the half-finished horse. He was better at this. He handed the piece of wood and the knife to Elias. "You try." Elias took them, his eyes wide. He had never held Tomlin's knife before. It was an object of power, of utility. He held the wood awkwardly and tried to copy the way Tomlin had held it. His first cut was clumsy, taking off too much wood. He winced. "Go with the grain," Tomlin said, pointing with his finger. "Don't fight it. See how it wants to split? Follow that." Elias tried again, more carefully this time. A small curling shaving of wood fell away. He kept at it, his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth in concentration. The horse Tomlin had started slowly began to look less like a horse and more like a misshapen lump. But Elias didn't stop. He was learning the feel of the wood, the way the blade moved through it. He was learning to make something. Tomlin watched him, the firelight catching the sharp planes of the boy's focused face. He was giving the boy the small things his own father had given him. He was passing something on. It wasn't a claim of land. It wasn't a name or a legacy. It was just this, the knowledge of how to go with the grain. And somehow, that felt more real, more lasting, than any deed filed in Abernathy's office. When the thaw finally came, it came with a vengeance. The creek roared, a muddy torrent of melted snow. The ground, frozen solid for months, softened into a thick, clinging mud. But the air smelled of wet earth, of life returning. They went back to the field. The stone wall they had built had held through the winter. The cleared plot of land was waiting. It was time to break the soil. Tomlin had fashioned a crude plow from a forked pine log, with the sharpened point of another log pegged into it. It was a heavy, clumsy tool. Without a horse to pull it, the work fell to him. He rigged a harness of rope and leather over his own shoulders and leaned into it, his boots sinking into the wet earth, his muscles straining to drag the point through the rocky soil. It was torturous work. Each furrow was a battle. Elias walked behind him, breaking up the larger clods of earth with a hoe Tomlin had made from a sharpened piece of shale lashed to a stick. They worked from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their clothes caked in mud. Days bled into weeks. The small patch of cleared land began to look like a field. The lines of the furrows, though crooked and uneven, held the promise of planting. Tomlin had saved a small portion of the beans from their winter stores, and he had a handful of corn kernels he had guarded like jewels. It wasn't much, but it was a start. On the day of the planting, the sun was warm on their backs. Tomlin walked the furrows, pushing a single bean or a kernel of corn into the earth with his thumb. Elias followed, covering the seeds with a gentle sweep of his hand, his touch surprisingly delicate. They didn't speak. The work was too sacred for words. They were entrusting their entire future to this thin, reluctant soil. They were planting their hope. When the last seed was in the ground, they stood at the edge of the field, looking at what they had done. It didn't look like much, just a patch of disturbed earth. But to them, it was everything. "Now we wait," Tomlin said. And they did. They tended the field with a fierce devotion. They pulled the relentless weeds. They chased away the crows. When a late dry spell threatened the young shoots, they carried water from the creek in makeshift buckets, bucket by weary bucket, giving each struggling plant a drink. And the seeds grew. First, tiny green shoots pushing their way through the dirt, then slender stalks reaching for the sun. The corn grew tall and spindly, the beans vined around the stalks. It was not a bountiful crop. The plants were thin, the ears of corn small, but it was life. It was food they had coaxed from a dead land. One evening in late summer, they were eating their supper by the fire, 2 small roasted ears of corn and a handful of boiled beans. The corn was sweet, the beans tender. It was the first meal grown from their own soil. Elias ate slowly, savoring each kernel. When he was finished, he looked across the fire at Tomlin. "No one ever comes here," he said. It was an observation, not a complaint. "No reason for them to," Tomlin replied. "Are we going to stay here forever?" Tomlin looked at the field, its stalks rustling in the evening breeze. He looked at the cabin, solid and squat against the darkening ridge. He looked at the boy, who was no longer the silent, flinching creature he had bought at the depot. He was a boy with a full belly and questions about forever. "Forever is a long time," Tomlin said. "We'll stay as long as the ground will have us." Elias seemed to accept this. He was learning that Tomlin's answers were like the land itself, simple, solid, and without flourish. That fall, they harvested their meager crop. They stored the corn and dried the beans, their small cabin now a larder as well as a home. The work had given them just enough to face another winter. It was the brutal, honest arithmetic of the land. You give it your sweat, your blood, your aching back, and in return, it gives you just enough to do it all again. As the years passed, this rhythm became their life. Clear more stones, expand the field, plant, tend, harvest, survive. Each year, the field grew by a few more feet. The stone wall grew longer. The soil, enriched by their compost and their care, began to yield a little more. They acquired a pair of goats, and their bleating added a new sound to the valley. Elias learned to milk them, his hands now strong and capable. He was growing into a young man. He was tall and lean, his face losing its boyish roundness and taking on the angular planes of his father, a fact that sometimes gave Tomlin a jolt. But the eyes were different. Elias's eyes were clear and steady, filled not with desperation, but with a quiet competence. He had learned the language of this harsh land, and it had shaped him. He and Tomlin still worked in a comfortable silence, but it was often punctuated by conversation now. Elias was curious about the world beyond the ridge, a world Tomlin had left behind. He asked about towns, about rivers, about the ocean Tomlin had seen once as a boy. Tomlin answered as best he could, dredging up memories that were covered in the dust of disuse. He never spoke of Kalen, not directly, but the brother was there, a constant, unspoken presence. He was in the way Tomlin favored his left side when he lifted something heavy, a habit formed from carrying his brother's weight. He was in the patch of wild columbine that Tomlin allowed to grow untouched at the edge of the field, because Kalen had always liked them. Elias knew. He never asked, but he knew. He saw the way Tomlin's gaze would sometimes go distant when he looked at the field, the way his hand would clench into a fist for a moment before relaxing. He knew that this land, this life, was built on a foundation of grief. One day, when Elias was nearly 16, they were working together to split logs for the winter. He was as tall as Tomlin now, and he swung the heavy maul with an easy, practiced strength. The maul struck the wood, and a sharp crack echoed in the valley. The log fell apart in two clean halves. Elias set down the maul and wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm. "I heard a name that day at the depot," he said, his voice calm and even. He didn't look at Tomlin, instead busying himself with stacking the split logs. "The men who were watching, the ones who called you mad." Tomlin stopped his own work, his axe resting on a log. He waited. "They said you gave up the Sharp claim," Elias continued. "They said you spit on your brother's grave. Your brother, Kalen Sharp." He said the full name, carefully, as if testing its weight. Tomlin's knuckles were white, where he gripped the handle of his axe. The air grew still and heavy between them. "My father's name was Jedediah Kane," Elias said, his voice dropping lower. "I know what he did. I heard the stories my whole life. Heard them from him when he was drunk and full of rage. Heard him blame the man he shot for his own ruin." He finally looked at Tomlin, his gaze direct and unflinching. I know he killed your brother." The truth, which had lain unspoken between them for so long, was finally laid bare in the bright, unforgiving sunlight. It was a raw and ugly thing. Tomlin let out a long, slow breath, the breath he had been holding for 7 years. He looked at the boy, the young man, before him. He saw the face of Jedediah Cain, but he saw the integrity of the land in his posture. He saw the sorrow in his eyes, but it was a clean sorrow, not the festering wound of guilt. "Yes," Tomlin said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the finality of a stone settling onto a wall. Elias nodded slowly. "All this time," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Tomlin couldn't name. "You took me. You fed me. You built this. With me. Why?" Tomlin looked away, toward the field. The corn was high, the leaves rustling like whispers. The bean vines clung to the stalks. It was a picture of interdependence, of life wrested from a barren place. "I didn't take you," Tomlin said, his voice rough. "I traded for you. You traded everything for the son of the man who—" Elias couldn't finish. "I told you," Tomlin said, turning back to him, his eyes boring into the boy's. "The land had a story on it I was tired of reading. It was about debt, and anger, and ghosts. I didn't want to read that story anymore." He gestured with his axe toward the field, the cabin, the stone wall. "So we wrote a different one." He looked at Elias, at the strong hands that had cleared stones and planted seeds, at the steady eyes that had watched and learned. "Your father gave you away for 5 pounds of flour," Tomlin said, his voice low and intense. "He put a price on you. I gave away the land to say you had no price, that's all. The rest is just work, and the work is good." He picked up his axe and turned back to the log. He swung, the blade biting deep into the wood. The sound echoed in the valley. Thwack. It was the sound of a period at the end of a long and difficult sentence. Elias watched him for a moment, then picked up his maul. He said nothing more. He went back to work. But the rhythm of their labor had changed. The silence that fell between them was no longer a silence of things left unsaid. It was a silence of things understood. The truth was out. It had not destroyed them. It had, in its own terrible way, made them free. The field was not just a place of sustenance anymore. It was a place of grace. A testament not to what was lost, but to what could be built in the ruins. The years continued their slow, steady passage across the valley. Tomlin grew older, the gray in his hair turning to white, the lines on his face deepening into the familiar topography of the land around them. A stoop entered his shoulders that had nothing to do with deference and everything to do with a lifetime of leaning into the earth. Elias was a man now, his strength at its peak, his knowledge of their small world complete. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his place, who has earned it with his own 2 hands. Their life was one of spare sufficiency. They had what they needed: food from the field, milk from the goats, warmth from the fire. They were unknown to the world beyond the ridge, a footnote in a forgotten ledger in Abernathy's office. The town, Tomlin suspected, had long ago written him off as dead or vanished, the madman who traded a kingdom for a ghost. One spring, after the planting was done, Tomlin began a new project. He chose a spot at the edge of the field where the stone wall met the patch of wild columbine he had always let grow. He found a large, flat slab of granite, and with a hammer and a sharpened steel spike he had fashioned, he began to chip away at it. Elias watched him work for several days, his curiosity held in check by his ingrained respect for Tomlin's private labors. Finally, he could not hold it in any longer. "What are you making?" he asked, joining Tomlin where he sat beside the stone. Tomlin didn't look up from his work. His hand was steady, his taps precise. Clink, clink, clink. "A marker," he said. "A grave marker?" Elias asked, his voice quiet. The only grave here was the unspoken one, the memory that had started it all. "No," Tomlin said. "Not for a grave." He blew the stone dust away from the letters he was carving. They were clumsy, uneven, but clear. He had almost finished the first name, Caelan. He paused, his gaze fixed on the letters. "A man's name should be on the land he loved," he said, more to himself than to Elias. "Even if his body is miles away, his story should be here." He worked for another week, his chipping the steady heartbeat of the valley. He finished the first name and, after a long pause, began the second, right below it, Elias. When he was done, he and Elias together lifted the heavy stone and set it upright at the head of the field. The two names were etched into the granite, one above the other. Not Sharp, not Cain, just the names, Caelan, Elias. They stood there for a long time, the afternoon sun warming the stone. The field stretched out before them, a patchwork of rich, dark earth and tentative green shoots. It was a living thing, breathing in the sunlight. "One buried," Tomlin said, his voice a low rumble. "One reborn." Elias looked at the marker, at the two names bound together in stone. He thought of the boy sold for flour, the silent, flinching creature he had once been. He looked at his own hands, calloused and capable. He looked at the field, a testament to years of shared, unending labor. And he looked at Tomlin, the man who had traded the world for him, who had given him not a name or a legacy, but something far more valuable. A place to put down roots. He felt the brutal arithmetic of it all, the terrible, beautiful balance of the trade. A life for a life. Land for a legacy. A brother lost. A son found. He reached down and placed his hand on the stone marker, his fingers tracing the rough edges of his own name, then the one above it. The stone was warm. It felt like a promise. "The field should have a name, too," Elias said, his voice steady. Tomlin looked at him, his pale blue eyes clear. "It has one," he said. He nodded toward the marker. "It has two." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his shoulders a little less stooped, his step a little lighter. Elias remained for a moment longer, his hand resting on the stone. The wind whispered through the new corn, and it sounded like the turning of a page. The story of debt was over. A new story, written in stone and soil, had taken its place. It was a quiet story, with no grand chapters or titles, just the steady, continuous rhythm of work and seasons, of growth and of peace. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows from the ridge, the final moment felt earned, inevitable, and complete.